Emmanuel, God among us. Amen. Please be seated. Mary laid the baby in a manger. Luke, whose telling of the birth of Jesus is rich with meaningful detail, tells us that Mary swaddled her baby and laid him in a manger. This young woman, visited by the angel Gabriel just 9 months prior or so, we presume, with the delivery of life-altering news, said, "Yes, be it done unto me according to your word." And even though this news could very well have ruined her as she was young, unmarried, and of no status, this young woman laid her baby in a manger. This woman whose labor had no doubt begun on the road, who likely had walked miles, having to stop at increasingly short intervals to hunch over, hands on her knees, or to lean into Joseph, while the contractions washed over her entire body. This young woman laid her baby in a manger. She and Joseph had been offered a stable, for there were no rooms left at the inn. Everyone was traveling to their hometowns for that pesky census, a decree from the emperor whose rule had become more than just pesky. It had been brutal, oppressive. Its purpose was to keep Mary and Joseph and all their people, the Jews, subjected and afraid. And so Mary and Joseph traveled to Bethlehem together, as Joseph was a descendant of David, this family of two who would become three much sooner than they anticipated. But the rooms in Bethlehem were all booked, the inns all a-clang and a-clatter with the noise of weary travelers, grateful for a meal and for company. The stable offered to this couple was at least private and quiet, save for the occasional braying of a donkey, the harumph and sigh of an ox. The animals created some warmth, the heat of their bodies radiating in the small enclosure, steam escaping in puffs from their wet noses, water droplets glistening and glittering against the darkness. There was a manger, of course, in this stable. Manger, after all, is a feeding trough for animals. And upon ending the hard labor of birthing a human person in the town whose name means bread basket, Bethlehem, Mary laid her baby in that manger. See, this detail that Mary laid her baby in a manger, it takes my breath away. Every Christmas, when we retell this story of the arrival of God among us, it's a detail that's easy to skim over, like names in an impossibly long biblical genealogy, which we would have gotten if we were reading Matthew's gospel. It's a detail that's easy to skim over in order to get to the real story, the story we know, the story we've heard again and again and again and year after year for decades. See, too often the manger is understood as the whole barn and not that feeding trough within it. But it's helpful to understand what the evangelist Luke, whose story of the experience of Jesus we hear from tonight, is a skilled storyteller. Luke doesn't add details simply for narrative color. Nope. Luke chooses his words wisely. And in this story of the nativity of Jesus, he lays the foundation for the epic story of the life of this little child. So he tells us that Mary, a nobody, a special young woman from nowhere, a nobody special young woman from a nowhere town, she laid that baby in a manger. She didn't clutch him to herself throughout the night, comfort to herself in the darkness. She didn't wrap him in blankets to hide him away from all of the dangers of the world that he was suddenly exposed to, now that he was outside of her own body. Bravely, boldly, this woman laid a baby in a manger. God had come to her. God drew so close that she bore the divine other in her very own body. Her yes to that angel Gabriel, a messenger of God, was an act of her faithfulness in God, the God that she knew was keeping promises made generations before her feet had ever touched the earth. The God that she knew would continue to keep promises for the generations to come. Even our generation. Even us, gathered here on this cold, kind of damp night in December in the old Irving Park neighborhood in Chicago. But here was that God in a stable in Bethlehem. Here was that strange and sudden miracle that she'd come to know in her body for months, now in her arms, here for the world, a great light, a great hope for all who had walked in darkness, for all who still walk in darkness, for a people some 2,000 years ago, for a people 500 years ago, for a people now, for a people especially now. We, the people of now, are not so unlike the people living in Luke's story. There is great disparity in wealth and power in our world, and it only looks to be increasing. The sirens have been sounding about the change in climate, which will certainly mostly affect the poor and the most marginalized among us. Laws are being planned to be written or overturned that would deny the very existence of God's beloved children whose gender and sexuality doesn't line up with one accepted standard. Depression and anxiety riddle not just a generation brought up on screens, not just a generation who grew up in a major global health pandemic, but everyone who attempts to meet the standards of our increasingly image-based, achievement-oriented economy and society and culture and racism, born of that original sin of patriarchy, runs rampant, even in the hearts of those of us who would like to think that we've cast off that system that rewards white people with power and privilege simply because they're white. It can all seem like too much, and it is. It's all too much. The compulsion to hunker down and to shut out and to put up walls and to isolate where it feels safe is real. I know that. It's understandable. But my friends, tonight, on this night, we retell the story of a woman who would have been justified to hold tightly to the hope that had arrived in that barn. It would have been understandable if she simply wanted to hunker down, to shut out, to put up walls, and to isolate so she could have kept her young family safe, so she could have kept this little child safe from all that threatened the promises of his life. But Mary laid her baby in a manger. Boldly, bravely, she laid her baby in a feeding trough because what she had been given was spectacular hope, spectacular affirmation of the promises of God to lift up the lowly. She laid her baby in a manger because this was Emmanuel, God among us, God among all of us, who is bread for the whole world. Amen.